Good morning. This is Carl Dakin, and this is the Successful Funding Show. For those of you new to the audience, welcome. Appreciate that participating this morning. And uh, I will have with me here momentarily. There's my guest, Eric Hansen. Good morning. Um,
Good morning.
Eric, all is now well in the world. And um, uh, as I was saying to the audience, welcome to the show. Feel free to make a comment, ask questions. We have with us, as my guest, Eric Hansen, one of the world's leading experts on many topics. So um, feel free to dig deep or to dip in well deeply to take advantage of his knowledge and experience. And this show is all about funding, and funding is an act of somebody going out and getting money from someone else in order to advance a project. This may be an idea that you want to take to market. It may be a small business that's already getting going or trying to grow. It could be a community project or even a charitable donation. And in my most recent work, which is taking a lot of my attention these days, is the concept of smart cities, which is an idea for the cities of the future, having all the bells and whistles, but also engaging all the residents in some form of democratic representation where they get good value for their money, something that's not been common in a lot of communities. So all kinds of things are open for discussion there. But our primary topic of today, which is why I'm happy to have Eric as my guest, is that we're going to talk about closing the gap with investors. For those of you who watched last week's show, I was describing the relationship between a investor candidate and an opportunity, an enterprise looking for funding as a middle school dance, where the boys were on one side of the auditorium, the girls were on the other side, and music was playing with nobody in the middle. And part of my role as an intermediary, as a consultant, and as the capital coach is to try to bring these two sides together so that they can get close enough that they can dance. So we talked about a lot of those issues last week, but this week we're going to focus just on the investor side. I'm working with Phil Bagley with Capstone Commercial Partners on a new suite of services that are all investor facing. So we know that a lot of the entrepreneurs that I work with, they don't have all the funding they need. They need funding. So they need to come to these investors and get some funding. And unfortunately, a lot of them, most of them, don't have all the money they need to tell their story properly, to be ready to receive capital. And they've done all they can do. And so they can't get any closer to the investor than they already are. So recognizing this limitation, I'm now working with Phil, and we'll be teaming with a number of people this year, trying to figure out how to get the investors to come closer to the particular opportunity that they may be interested in, or they may not even be aware of. So in this endeavor of mine to bring these two together so they can dance, we're looking at a number of services, the first of which is just to make the opportunity aware to the investors who may not know they exist. This is a common issue of any small business, any opportunity. 8 billion people in the world, but less than a double handful may know you even exist. So they have no chance of investing. But if once they do know and they're looking at this opportunity, then they're saying to themselves, do I really want to do this or not? Or do I know enough to make an informed decision? Or do I even know how to make my own decision? These are all good questions. So this is what we're going to talk about is how do we bring these investors a little bit closer? And what we're proposing in these services is that at a first level, we invite the investor to pay for a due diligence review of the opportunity. this would seem to be a natural, logical path to take, but quite often investors spend little or no money on due diligence. They look at a deal, they love it, they invest in it. They look at a deal, don't understand it, they walk away. They go to an advisor, their wealth advisor, accountant, or lawyer, who looks at it and says it's risky, you should not do it, and tells them to go away. So we're saying, hey, we're going to put together some teams who can look at any deal, anytime, anywhere, and give you an independent, objective due diligence assessment of this opportunity. If they like that, what they see, which is a relatively small dollar investment, then they can ask for a full commercialization plan, not the one that's developed by the enterprise or by the small business or whoever. This again would be developed by third parties who've been there, done that, who understand the business, the markets, and so forth. And with that, they're going to create what they think would be the best path to market, the least amount of money to be spent, the greatest risk reduction that can be accomplished within a reasonable time frame, and say, do you want us to build a plan for that? And if the investor says, yes, I'll pay a little more money to have the plan developed the way professionals would see the plan developed, then they're like dip both toes in the water at that point. And if they like what they see there within the due diligence and the plan, then they can step up and make the major investments that's required to move that business, that opportunity forward. And that's where they can get out their checkbook and write the big checks. So it's a multi-step progression going from a little to a lot of money, but it gives them a chance to take a good look at this, not just from their perspective, but from the perspective of outside professionals who've been there, done that. And this gives them greater comfort, greater capability. So what we're trying to do is overcome the reasons why an investor would say no. And Eric's been a guest on my show before, where we talked about all the reasons to reject a deal. That it's, you didn't punctuate it right, you put it in multiple types of fonts, anything good or goofy that gives an investor a reason to walk away. We've talked about that. So now we're saying, okay, we're committed. We want this investor to take a serious look at this deal. We think that this is really a good match between the opportunity and the investor, despite having a lack of information on both sides of this deal, meaning that we don't know everything we need to know about the opportunity. We also don't necessarily know exactly what the investor is going to invest in. So how do we close this gap? And so, Eric, as a first step, you see deals all the time that come to you, new technologies, new ways of doing things. We've been doing a lot of talking about how to improve the energy efficiency of buildings, how to generate new power in buildings, amongst other things. And so we find an investor who we think looks like the person who would care about this, have the money to invest in this. It looks like it fits who they are. How would you go about, as a first step, asking this person to take a look at this deal? What would you think of first?
Well, if you don't mind, I want to take one step back because I read it.
We have an hour.
So I read a really interesting article published by Kevin O'Leary just recently, and he's the famed Shark Tank investor extraordinaire, billionaire, all this stuff, right? And what was really interesting is he finally admitted that he has overwhelmingly lost massive amounts of money investing in Shark Tank deals. Just incredible. So I want to take this step back because there's an example of people getting to the right investors, but really not even having a product. But it has such great, it's like you go to Mr. Steak. Mr. Steak doesn't exist anymore. But you go to a steakhouse, and the old word was you sell the sizzle, not the steak. So what Kevin O'Leary's done, and he's now changing his whole tune, is he bought into the sizzle. He was on it. And he's finding out, oh my God, it didn't work. okay, so he's readjusting what he's doing. And how does that relate to how do you get to the investor, and how do you show what's going on? So in my opinion, you still have to have the sizzle, because otherwise they don't care. You've got to have sizzle. But I think what you're talking about, Carl, is the need for a third party to show up with a document that isn't written by you, which says, okay, I can do this, and here's 10 experts. And whether they're actual experts really does matter, because if it turns, and have them out there, they've been successful. And I'll give you an example. So we're trying to do a project in Nigeria right now, and it's a fish farm. It's hydroponics, so fish with a greenhouse and all of that. So what we're doing is we're presenting a plan and a proposal to the Nigerian government, who they need agriculture. So that's the other thing. Address a real need. So you have your need, wants, and desires, right? And so what we did is we went to several of the largest aquaponics guys and said, okay, we're not going to buy your $100 million system, because this is going in Nigeria. They don't have $100 million. If you were doing this from scratch and you weren't selling your own system, can we get this done for a reasonable fee? And what would the design look like? Well, it turns out they did come up with a design. Turns out it doesn't cost that much. Turns out that you can actually do the whole ding dang thing for probably less than $100,000. But so that's in process, but it took the initiative to go to the actual experts and say, come on, this $1 million thing you got that is great for if you're selling to Saudi Aramco, right? Yeah. It ain't so good when you're selling to a farmer in Nigeria. So I guess that would be my advice. If you can, make sure you have that in your bailiwick. Hopefully that didn't go overboard.
Yeah, no, so this is, well, there's a whole bunch of recommendations for entrepreneurs on what they can do to get ready to receive capital. And one of those is third-party verification validation, meaning that the entrepreneur may be the world's expert on their technology. They may have studied the market, intensely. They may know more than anybody else about the particular topic of their business. But every time they say anything about their business, it automatically is biased, because it's coming from the mouth of the person looking for the money. And so nothing against them at this point. They may have done all they can do, but now they're talking to an investor who, let's use your example, a hydroponics facility to grow indoors fish and plants at the same time. They go to the investor who they think should put up the money. This could be a private individual who is looking for a regular investment, not likely, but it could be. It could be an impact investor who wants to put purpose ahead of profit and thinks that doing something in Nigeria would meet their criteria for helping people in the community. So that's a possibility. Could be a foundation that might do this as a grant or through a program-related investment where they had actually taken equity interest in this. And we're talking to them. And in that first blush, we cannot assume they know anything about hydroponics. They may not know anything about the market for foods in Nigeria, either fish or produce. And at this point, they also don't know the company or the project that's seeking the money for the hydroponics. So we have no prior relationship. We have basically an empty basket with regard to knowledge about the project and the markets and anything else that would ordinarily go into the decision making. And yet we think, because we've been down this path so many times, we see the possibility that this investor may invest in this project. So what we tell people is, hey, verify if you have any new invention under the sun, something that somebody hasn't seen before, or even if you're doing something some other people have done, you go outside and you get an expert's opinion. This may be in the form of a CPA review of your books. It could be in the form of an engineering analyst who's familiar with the type of products, which in your case, you're talking about going to the leading hydroponics manufacturers in the world. It could be somebody like that. And at the end of the day, though, these are only verified bits and pieces of the overall thing that represents the business opportunity that we're talking about. So here we're suggesting that we go to the investor and go, how would you like essentially a review of the business opportunity by an outside group, an objective panel of experts to tell you if they think this makes sense or not. And not only are we looking at the business side of this, but we're also looking at your investment criteria, your capability. So if an example, I remember talking with the head of the Securities Commission for Colorado. This is 2 or 3 commissioners ago, which is part of my age problem. But he said, I never want to sell a bad investment to my Aunt Maud, because I'll hear about it at Thanksgiving, every Thanksgiving for the rest of my life. So in this case, you have to make sure that the investment opportunity is a good fit for the investor. You can't assume just because the investor has money that this makes sense for them. For a variety of reasons, they may be having trouble with their own cash flow. They may be looking to do other deals. They may need a different term or other requirement on the deal. So when you look at a deal objectively, yes, it makes sense to get this expert group to do a review of the entire business, not just a singular component. But you also want to look at the investor's needs, the investor's wants, the investor's motivations, and be able to address things that maybe even they themselves can't articulate well. And this is a point. I was in Dallas last week for 2 days at the National Religious Broadcasting Conference at the Gaylord Texan, and meeting with a lot of people who are looking for funding. And they're going like, we're ready to receive funding. And I said, who's your investor candidate? They couldn't give me a guess. They couldn't profile, couldn't tell me anything. I says, what do they need to know? And they're like, well, we have a slide deck, which was generally empty of half of the information that really should have been in it. I said, you have to realize that just because the investor has money doesn't mean they have any skill or capability in making an investment decision. And therefore, if you don't give them everything and beyond in this investment slide deck, they may not be able to make a decision, even though they like you, they like your project. They may think it's going to make money, and they still can't write a check because you haven't given them everything they need. And I said, a lot of these investors have no training in making investments. They just happen to have money. They may have made it in another business. They may have inherited it. They may have won a lottery ticket. I don't care how they came by their money, but that doesn't make them a skilled investor. And okay. And so what a lot of these people do is they hire people who should help them, give them advice. This may be a wealth advisor. It may be an accountant, an attorney, could be somebody else. And these people may or may not have the skills to invest in a deal. And what I've found is a lot of the wealth advisors, if you give them a perfect investment opportunity, they can go, yes, I can make a decision about that. But if it's missing anything, and all the pitches I've seen in the last several weeks are missing 1, 2, or more things. If it's missing just one thing, they can't make a decision because that's not their experience. They haven't been out running businesses. They haven't been out putting deals together. They haven't been figuring out how to go to market, all of the many things that an entrepreneur is required to do. And so they look at it and they go, it's not perfect. I have to say no. And they tell their client, the investor, no, and it's a no. There's not going to be an investment. So, Eric, understanding that investors are not the perfect investor candidate, they're just investors, people with money. How would you go about, first off, talking to an investor to try to introduce them to your hydroponics deal in a way that would not only give them the information about the opportunity, but address the investor's quite possible lacking of skills to make an investment decision?
Well, I'm going to take another step back because, Carl, you and I are both very familiar with private placements and how they work and what they're supposed to do. And there's a big section in that called risk factors. And I would say the biggest mistake people do is they say, here's my risk factors because this meets my attorney's keep me out of trouble zone, right? But nowhere in the presentation do they actually address the risk factors as it associates with their project, and how are they going to mitigate those risk factors?
No, I totally agree with you.
Right.
You'll see a laundry list that might be 4 or 5 when it should be 20 or 30, but they're just a statement of the risk. And then there's no, and we have addressed this risk by taking the following actions. We've hired this person who knows what's going on. We've studied the market. We've bought the marketing report. We've bought insurance, or we have a fallback strategy, which is if this doesn't happen, we do this. None of that is ever in there.
Right. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because when we first presented this project it was to the Nigerian government for obvious reasons. One thing we did right is we put the risk factors together, and then we line item the ones that we could control, not the ones that we couldn't control, the ones we could control, and identified exactly how that would be done. And if it required a piece of equipment, this is how it was done. And this doesn't say this project's going to get funded. Right. I'm not saying that, but at least the project made it from the local government to the state government. Now they can't do anything either, but at least it's come from the little village to the people in charge of the village, and it's moving up the food chain. And I think that's a big thing for people to understand. This whole risk factor thing is huge, because if you don't identify it, and your potential investor actually, 2 things. 1, thinks of a risk factor that you didn't think of. And then 2, you can't answer the problem. You are toast. You are totally toast.
No, I so totally agree with you. It's so interesting in a pit when, and I'm typically sitting there alongside of the entrepreneur, kind of like a bad date sometimes, but we're sitting there, and I'm watching the pitch being made, and sure enough, as you described it, you'll get a question that may be perfectly logical. It's a softball over a home plate. You should be able to hit it out of the park for a home run, and the entrepreneur is not prepared for it. They either swing and miss, which is you're out, go home, or they may hit basically a blooper to the pitcher they're throwing out at first, and there's no excuse for that. They should know their business well enough to take all the easy questions, but then you'll get harder questions, ones which my response is you should know your business well enough that you not only can answer the question thoroughly, completely, and most importantly, concisely, but you can offer to go one level deeper in information. So if they go, well, how's that hydroponics going to work in a windstorm? And you go, the building has been tested to wind speeds up to 85 miles an hour. Mm-hmm. But because we're familiar with some of the storms in the area, we are going to also be using secondary anchors, to hold the building in place. And I'd be happy to share information with you on how those anchors work. And invariably, the guy goes, nope, I don't need to know that, but thank you very much for offering to give me more detail than I asked for, because you've just demonstrated you're not going to beat me on a bunch of easy questions. And that changes the whole tenor of the thing. And as you say, that gets you bumped up to the next level, because once you get past the easy questions, they can't ask anymore. They might as well pass you along to the next decision maker in the process, because they're done with their role. They're not going to get yelled at like, I saw this thing you handed to me. You never asked them about this. And when I asked them, I was embarrassed that they didn't have an answer. And everybody looks bad. But before we jump into that, I want to say hello to the guest in our audience. Zach Dane is with us this morning. Zach is working on a system for fractional ownership, starting with real estate. And we've been having some very interesting discussions about how this can change markets and access to capital, and also access to opportunities, particularly for people who are not accredited investors. And Zach, you sent me an email, which I haven't had a chance to look at. I will be out most of the rest of the day and tomorrow at an economic development conference in Craig, Colorado, for the Economic Development Council of Colorado. So I'll try to get back to you sometime between now and the end of the week. Then Omar is with us this morning. Good morning, Omar. Omar puts on his own shows. He has 2 or 3 different formats now where he invites guests and gives them hard questions. And I got to video me asking one of the hard questions. It's like inserting me into Jeopardy. Instead of having the guy up there, I get to ask the question. So thank you, Omar, for that opportunity. It's nice to be on Celebrity Squares or whatever it is, and be the person with the hard question. Yeah, so this is what we're getting at when we're talking today, is that if you're going to talk to an investor, you have to anticipate that they're going to have questions. I mean, that's kind of what the review process is about. You think you may have answered some of these questions in a slide deck, but quite frankly, a slide deck is the sizzle, it's the overview, it's kind of the shiny object that you wave to get their attention. There's no way you're going to put enough data and information into a slide deck to answer everybody's questions. So what's commonly behind that is a longer narrative document, an offering memorandum, or a prospectus, as it may be called. And this is intended to not only answer the questions most of the time, but also meet any regulatory requirements that may be set for, like crowdfunding or something else, where a state or federal agency says you got to answer at least these minimum questions. But it still may not be enough. You still may get a question from an investor that is a demonstration, I'll just put it this way, a demonstration of their lack of competency and capability to ask good questions. So they may ask you a question, you're like, well, that has nothing to do with anything that we're talking about today. And you have to gracefully guide them back into the conversation. And this was actually a technique I learned way back in law school when we were doing moot court competitions. Somebody would give you a wild card question, and sometimes it was a demonstration of lack of capability. Sometimes it was intentional just to throw us during the competition. But you would answer the question first, say you've asked this, and this is the answer, if there is an answer to the question. But if the question is framed badly, then you have says, I think what I heard you say is this, and you reframe the question, and then you answer that question. Now, it's a little bit of a shuck and dive, because we may not want to answer their question. We may want to give them a new question we can answer very well. But what you're doing is you're demonstrating to them that you're listening to them, which is a demonstration of respect. And that's something that's very, very important, that you're paying attention throughout any pitch to what the other person is asking, and you're trying to answer their question like you would as an advisor or consultant. But you want to win this game, so you want to give them a great answer. As Eric said, if you know there are risks associated with your business, they should be broken into three groups. Ones that One that we know we can nail, meaning we can get rid of that risk. We can absolutely eradicate it. The second one, we can mitigate it by taking some action. You want to have that planned and know what that is going to look like. And the third are ones you can't do anything about. So if a president of your country should impose a tariff on a country you're bringing in product, that doesn't fall under the first category because you can't stop that from happening. But you may have a way to work around it, and you should have thought through this, even though you may not have been given a great head start. You may have been told yesterday you need to be ready to answer the question tomorrow. That you may say, well, yes, there's a tariff if it comes in to the United States this way, but if we go this way through a treaty with an adjoining nation, then it's perfectly legal and we can go around the tariff, or we're not going to have to pay the tariff. Or all of our competition is going to be paying the same tariff. We're going to raise our prices to reflect the increase in cost, but so is everybody else. So we may lose customers on the low end, but we're not going to lose them to our competitors. There's your answer. But if you say, I'm not sure what we're going to do, the investor is going, then why should I give you my money? Because you're just guessing. I got a little bit crosswise with one of many people I was talking to yesterday, where I said, how are you going to promote your program? And he said, we're going to work with some influencers. I said, great. And what's your budget for marketing your product when it goes to market? He gave me a number. And I said, and what part of that is the influencer's fee? Knowing that influencers may charge a little to half of the total amount of the price point, like an affiliate fee. And they go, we haven't worked that out. And I'm like, how can you have a budget for promotion that's dependent upon influencers when you haven't even asked them what their fee is going to be? And the guy didn't answer my question. He goes, oh, we have a budget for that. And I'm like, okay, you have a budget. You pulled the number out of thin air. You've never done it before. You don't know what you're talking about. You're dependent upon this group, and you decline even ask them right now what it would cost because you're afraid of their answer, which means you're ducking the question, and you're losing my points in my book. Every time you open your mouth at this point, you have to know as much as you can. You may not have an answer to everything, and if you get to a question that really you can't answer, don't try to skip through it. Don't try to, shine on it. Just say, I don't know enough about that to give you a good answer. I will find an answer and get back to you. Make that a firm commitment. You may have already lost the pitch. They may decide they're not going to ask you back, or even if you get the answer. But you should put it in your repertoire of answers to questions, because somebody else may assuredly ask the same question sooner or later. So Eric, now that we have an investor who knows nothing about hydroponics and nothing about Nigeria and nothing about the market for foods in Nigeria, how are you going to get this person? What's going to warm them up? What's going to get them to hang in there so you can get beyond this first contact with an alien species known as an investor and communicate with them in a way that's going to get them to take a second meeting?
So in our little ecosystem inside this little village, what we did, I'm not doing it, but my investor friend down there is doing it. He first went to the tribal elder, okay? And this is kind of how things in the remote parts are done. So the first thing he did is went to the tribal elder and presented this idea. And in the process of doing this, you have to have that person's blessing. Well, how do you get that person's blessing? So food security is a major deal, not just in Nigeria, but all over the world. So the pitch is basically, if we build this here, we're going to create food security, meat, fish, vegetables, which are a circular system that you have to monitor, but you're not going to take away from the other things that you're doing in your village. So we got the okay we got the blessing, right, in the village. That was the very first thing, because he has to, in this case, sometimes it's a she, they have to be able to believe that it's going to benefit their people. If they don't believe it's going to benefit their people, they're not going to go to the next step. So he believes that this is going to benefit the people. He believes that the budget is now not outrageous. He believes that the risks can be mitigated. This is an interesting thing, and I'm kind of going down into some detail we probably shouldn't or don't need to, but one of the big deals, believe it or not, was electricity. How are we going to have the power to do this project? Because if you're in a remote part of the globe, even in the United States, electricity is a big darn deal, right? So and you can't just throw up a bunch of wind turbines and this, that, and the next thing. So really an interesting segue to this, turns out they have abandoned oil wells, just like we do here. Well, they have methane gas. So we are now bringing in a different party, a third party. And this third party, their job is going to be to put in a genset, hook it up to this abandoned oil well, which is polluting the groundwater and everything around them, so that there's a guaranteed amount of electricity for this little project. Now, obviously, there's going to be some solar panels and things like that. But now suddenly you're having a more inclusive solution. But we only got there because this local chieftain, if you will, he had bigger vision, right? And we had to accommodate that bigger vision. So now we're going to the next phase, which is the regional government. And it looks like Schmeezy is going to get this done. But it takes, and this may not be the answer anybody's looking for, but you have to have your person who is emphatically for you to make it done. And sometimes you have to change. You have to do a little pivot, right? And we found that guy. And so the little pivot was, okay, his real problem isn't necessarily food. His real problem is that this abandoned oil well is polluting his water. I mean, so you've got to be open to that. So sometimes it's bigger than what you think. You've got this little teeny project, but if your project can solve what they perceive as the bigger problem, the investor is really happy about that.
Yeah, no, but the investor is coming to you, and you have to assume it's a blank slate. You have to assume that they know nothing, and you have to give them all necessary information. And at the same time, when you look at the problem, you're going, well, we should have done this anyway. I'm not doing this just for the investor. I needed to know. And I mean, and if the investor knew anything about projects in Africa, they'd be familiar with the tribal approval process. The chief or whoever's the head of a village is a gatekeeper who has to be signed off on this, or you're not going to get anything to happen. And so the investor, if they have that knowledge, they would ask you, do you have the chief's approval? And what documentation do you have of that? And then, of course, they would ask you, then, do you have the local government's approval? And they're going to walk you all the way up. And as you were describing it, you have to get the national government's approval to make this happen. You want their blessing at the very least, even if they're not writing the check. But if these are all things, and this is no different from doing say a new building in a small rural community here in Colorado, which is where I'm going to be later today. I know that I'm going to have to get a building permit. I'm going to have to be within a zoning compliance. I'm going to have a number of people, engineers and other people, sign off on this before I can present it to an investor and say, we've checked all the boxes, we've gone all the way out. And not only do I have permission to build the building, but I already have gone out and found a tenant for the building, a customer for this. Too often, entrepreneurs make an assumption that their product, their service is so wonderful, so great that the customers are going to come. Even if they don't know about it, even if they've never heard about it, somehow they're going to overcome this lack of awareness and they're going to make a purchase. And it doesn't work that way. It takes time to make your products and services aware to your customers in the same way you have to take time to make it aware your opportunity to an investor. And you have to put that into your schedule. It was part of the problem yesterday with this conversation where I'm like, it may take you 6 months to raise money. And then you're going to use part of that money to try to build your crowd to sell, what you're going to sell. And oh, by the way, you're telling me that in less than 12 months, you want to be in the marketplace. I think our calendars are out of sync here. I don't know how you're going to get all that done. And so you have to look at this and make sure that everyone that has to participate in your vision has signed off. If this is a future customer, a future tenant in a building, you want that. If you're going to do a hydroponics thing, I would want a buyer for the produce coming out of this. I'd want to have a soft agreement or even a forward agreement with a retailer or somebody from the hydroponics so that we know that whatever food is produced, there's a market for it. We know what the price point is going to be. So now we have a complete business model. Instead of hoping and guessing, there will be a buyer and the price will be the price that I want to cover my cost of operations. This is a common error, but again, we're facing the investor who may not know any of this. So we may have to get out a 5th grade level presentation and say, here's the situation. We have a village in Nigeria. They need better food, more food, and we're going to set up a hydroponics operation. This sounds very logical to this point, but then we're into the question of who's paying for this. Well, we need to raise money in order to build this, a capital upfront cost. We're going to pay it back over time by selling this locally and through retailers in the nearby city. I've actually seen these plans, so I can almost write the story. And here's the price points. Here's the dealers. Here's statements from 2 or 3 of these that they would welcome a new supplier with this volume of food, which would match what can be created within the hydroponics facility. And we're going down that path, and they're going like, okay, now the numbers make sense. Now, one of the questions that'll come up is who's going to operate this facility? Is this something that's going to require an on-site technician that's there 24/7? Because I've seen marijuana grow facilities where the thermostat failed to work a particular night, and the entire crop in the hundreds of thousands of dollars was toast by the following morning. Now, if we're growing tomatoes and beans and so forth, they also can die if there's a problem with heat being too high or too low. So somebody's got to be monitoring this hydroponics facility with an alarm by their ear that goes off with sensors if something's not working right. And does somebody need to be trained on that? So here's more questions. And so these are, having been through pitches on this kind of a topic, these are questions that investor may ask. They may not. They may go, I know all about greenhouses. I used to own 5 hydroponic stores. And you're like, great, he knows more than I do. I am now really worried. Because they're going to ask questions I probably we go. I always love that switch in the middle of the show. So now I can take the other position of the argument. But if they ask a question that shows they know more about this than you do, you should take advantage of that carefully to say, this is what we're doing. Is that what you would do, or would you prefer that we do something different? Which is now you're out of your first pitch, you're into a second or third level pitch because they skipped all these steps in asking you questions, and now you have to answer more stuff. And it may be that you, the person making the pitch, can't answer it, but somebody on your team can, in which case you have to say, I can't answer that directly, but Joe or Sally on my team can. I can ask them to get back to you, or I can set up another call and we can go over this issue. But you're always got to be ready to answer the question and deal with the question so that the investor never walks away with an unanswered question or without a commitment to answer that question, because it's too easy for them to go, I've got 100 deals on my desk. I'm going to do one that looks more prepared, more qualified, better matches what I'm looking for, and they can answer my questions. You can't assume they know anything, and you have to be prepared to answer anything, and you need to have stuff lined up. It's like you're taking a major exam at a university level, and you're not quite sure what the professor is going to ask you. So Eric, what else can we do to set the table?
Yeah, so everything you're saying is 100% correct.
Of course.
The one thing that most people, of course, but one thing that people forget about, and it's really baffling to me, and not all projects, we always think that a project must be profit motive. That's not always the case. Now, even in this little project over there in Nigeria, there is a profit motive piece, and there is a piece that requires, right? That requires a contribution nonprofit piece, okay? And you want, if you have a project that you can break out, this piece needs to be a nonprofit. This piece is where the profit is. This piece is the growth aspect. Then I think you're going to be better off, because now you're going to be able to target your investor or investors better. Because, and I see it all the time, and Carl, I know you see it all the time. You have an investor, the only thing they do is if they're going to get their 6 to 10% return. And if you can't show that, why are you talking to them?
Right.
Why? Forget it. This is not your guy. But if you have a situation where you say, hey, my nonprofit piece is I need to build the greenhouse. I need to build the raceways for the fish. I need to put in the oxygen generators. That's my nonprofit piece. My profit piece is I'm going to have vegetables, I'm going to have fish, and it's going to be fish more likely, you're going to have fish that you like to eat, not fish that we want to grow. That's the profit piece. And the profit piece, the way this works is I need a totally different investor group, because this piece, the profit piece, requires distribution channels. This other piece did not. And I think for a lot of people, they and not all, most projects we talk about are strictly profit, strictly in that economic zone. But there's a lot of projects where people could look at their project and they could say, maybe there's some public better interest by separating some things out. And just my observation.
No, I totally agree with you. There's a tendency, as we look at an opportunity for the first time, to think of it as this thing, okay?
Yeah.
And then as we assess, analyze, synthesize this down, we go, well, actually, what you're proposing is a group of activities. Some of these activities will generate revenue, some will not. Some will generate profit from those activities. Some may break even, which means they're sustainable, but they're not profitable. and some are going to be upside down. They're running at a deficit. And it may be that you intentionally designed this so that the profit is offsetting the nonprofit with the goal of addressing whatever the nonprofit portion of this is. That's a legitimate design point, but it needs to be recognized within what you're doing. But you may find something that he says, as a result, I may try to get a grant or a charitable contribution to cover the nonprofit portion. I may get a different investor who may be an impact investor who's willing just to get their money back. And then for that portion that is generating profits at a high enough scale, an ROI high enough to attract different types of investors, I may be 3 types of investors to get my bundle, my capital stack put together to do this particular project. And as you mentioned, it may turn out that the energy generated from capturing the methane and converting it to electricity may pay for this entire project all by itself, because that electricity may be great enough not only to power this hydroponics operation, but maybe the entire village, or maybe 4 or 5 other businesses that need electricity in order to operate within this area. And so this is why often I will tell somebody, now that you think you have a grasp on your revenue streams and your activities and your different investor groups, let's pause for a moment. Let's step back from this and look at our community. What's our impact on the community? What kind of taxes are we paying? What kind of people are we hiring? What kind of training are we doing in order to bring this forward? And we start looking for additional revenue streams, which may be complementary or enabling, meaning I may not even get this hydroponics thing to go unless I do this well over here and deal with that. Because if I deal with that, then this becomes not only doable, but it becomes obvious at this point in time. We're working with a smart city project right now where we think we've identified 2 or 3 power sources. We don't have any businesses that need that power. So it would be natural for us to go out and basically build businesses into the community that can take advantage of the excess power that would be generated, which creates greater economic activity within the community and will give this community basically an ability to stabilize and rebuild itself over time. So there's a lot of analysis that can go into this, and too often entrepreneurs act too quickly. They don't do the entire analysis, and even if their analysis is correct, when they're talking to the investor is going, I hear everything you're saying, but do you have anyone other than yourself who will tell me what you're telling me? Can you bring in an expert on hydroponics? Can you bring in an expert on capturing the methane from that oil well? Can you bring in an expert for a local grid for a village? We can layer all these experts, but at the end of the day, we also need somebody to look at this from a business perspective, the global business perspective, and say this business is viable. It should be profitable. If we structure our money this way, we're going to have 3 to 8 kinds of investors or different investor groups. And we need to get soft commitments from each of them before we pull the trigger on this thing, because if any one of them falls down, maybe the whole house of cards in our vision falls apart. So tons of homework, and everybody is trying to get to money as early as possible. It's natural in what we're trying to do. But if you go to an investor too early without having everything lined up, all your boxes checked, all your commitments in documented, then you're telling the investor that I'm rushing, I'm in a hurry, and I'm not as concerned about you losing money as maybe I should be. And that comes across very badly when you're talking to an investor. But if you walk in with a deal that's perfected, and it's actually, if you read my newsletter yesterday, I put out a daily newsletter as often as I can, Monday through Friday, called Instant Funding. You can get it on LinkedIn. And yesterday I put in the first part. Now I do what's called a funding fortune. And this is like a Chinese fortune cookie, except it's about funding. So sometimes it's not quite as funny as a fortune cookie, but sometimes it's funnier than some of the most recent fortunes I've read, but that's an aside opinion. But if you can bring something to an investor that looks like it's a done deal, they want that. They prefer that. And it's on you to close that gap as much as possible, to understand that the investor can only do so much. And if this is beyond your capability or beyond your understanding, or you don't understand how to talk to investors because it's like talking to an alien from a foreign planet, then you need a translator, an interpreter, maybe a diplomat, some kind of intermediary who can talk to the investor in their words, in the manner in which they need to hear them in order for them to make a decision. They represent a very super specialized type of marketplace with a customer who has to see something bigger than your product, bigger than your bio. They're looking at the entirety of the business over time. And you need to be able to communicate that to them in a way they understand, and also be able to verify that they are a true candidate, so you're not spending all your time talking to a bad pitch. So Eric, knowing that I've been 100% right most of the time today, but thank you for your comment. This is a topic that we're going to come back to again in future sessions of this Successful Funding Show. We're going to try to help everyone out there who's trying to get funded, and actually investors who are looking for opportunities. We're going to try to act as diplomats and bring both sides to the table, unlike a certain White House meeting recently, which has been in the paper all week. But we're going to try to get people to work together for their mutual benefit, because that's what the investment is all about. And if they are talking apples and oranges, then we need to get them on the same page, working towards the same outcomes. If there are, I'll say, different sets of desired outcomes that don't match up at all, then this isn't going to work. If there's 2, 3, or 4 common elements, we may be able to piece a deal together. It may not be perfect, but it may get both sides enough value that they'll do the deal. So any last thoughts before we call it a day here, Eric? Any words of wisdom that cannot go unnoticed until a later date?
Well, the words of wisdom, let's see here. Don't start an argument or a war that you can't win. You know, in the great Charlie Munger, if many people don't even know who this guy is, some people do. He said something that is absolutely true. No matter what you believe or where you go, he said, there's profit in confusion. And you know what? We are living in times where there is massive confusion. And with that, there is profit. And there's profit for those people that are willing to think it through. And that includes people who are trying to get funding for a new business. Just because we now live in or becoming, if you will, a country of uncertainty, if you will, especially amongst our quote allies, which we don't think we need. In this uncertainty, there's going to be huge opportunity for business to get funded in their projects and do things that are outside of the spheres of influence that now are dominating the news cycle. So am I positive? Of course, because I think business is a lot smarter than people think.
Yeah, as entrepreneurs, glasses are neither half full or half empty. They're simply the wrong size glass. So with that last word of wisdom, I'm going to let everybody go. Thanks to our audience today for listening in to this episode of the Successful Funding Show. Thank you, Eric, for being my guest today. And hopefully everybody learned a little bit more about how to work with investor candidates, and how to come closer together so that there is a possibility that by the end of the evening, there will be somebody dancing on the dance floor. Take care, everyone. We'll see you next week.
See you, Carl.